Well, I thought I had this mining thing down, but then 3.19 has come along and it's quite literally torn up the script. So this patch we're going to be starting from scratch. But for me at least, these changes have huge amounts of potential, and they've certainly livened up the mining profession for me. So in this video, I'm going to do my best to break down what I think are the best strategies for miners in the verse and the different things you might well be thinking about. And while I've tried my hardest to distill the info, there's no getting away from the fact that there's just a metric ton of it. And I personally try to make the guides that I'd want to follow, so they do tend to be on the detailed side. And while this is going to be a long one, I'm hoping it's going to be time well spent. So if that all sounds good to you, grab a cup of tea while I roll the intro, and then let's get into it. Hello and welcome back or welcome to the channel. I'm Loudguns, and while I love pretty much all of the gameplay that Star Citizen has to offer, my personal playstyle is somewhat more industrial. In particular, I like that special magic that is turning big rocks into smaller rocks and then into piles of space bucks. And with 3.19, the mining games just got turned on its head completely, so it's time for a brand spanking new handbook. This is hot off the presses, and I think it's worth prefacing it with the fact that these changes are all of a month old at this stage. The last version of my mining guide was the third of the Quantanium Rush meta, and as such it had been finely honed over a couple of years. I fully expect that I'll be making a series of addendums to this in future videos, and ultimately that I'll need to release further updated versions. However, what I feel we can do comfortably now is provide a good guide to folks starting out in the mining profession, and pass some tips on to older players trying to get to grips with the new patch. If you do happen to be the newest of new players though, and you haven't quite decided whether or not to jump into SC, hopefully this rundown of mining might stir some interest for you. One of StarCit's strongest points to my mind is its variety. Not everything is shooting bad guys with lasers, sometimes we shoot rocks with lasers as well. Just be sure if you create an account to use someone's referral code, mine's the one up on screen, but if you've got a friend who already plays, just ask them for theirs. Before we dive into the guide, there is an elephant in the room that I want to address from the start, and that's the earning potential of mining. Prior to 3.19, the mining meta focused purely on Quantanium, the verse's most valuable mineable. And locating it wasn't hard, and mining any rock instant in solo was possible. As a result of that, solo miners in a Prospector could reliably make 400 to 500k an hour, while those willing to take the larger multi-crew mole out on their own could bank more than that, sometimes hitting the holy grail of 1 million credits an hour. And with the 3.19 changes, this is just no longer possible. There are rocks out there that solo players simply cannot crack, and one stone that we found the other night took 7 lasers to break. It's not a straight line, but typically higher value materials have higher mass, so if you want to get to the really good stuff like Quantanium now, you're probably going to need to multi-crew. I know that these numbers are going to put some people off and possibly harm my viewer retention, but there's no point making you stick around only to disappoint you at the end. So I believe that solo prospectors now can still comfortably make 150k plus an hour, with particularly lucky or skilled, depending on who you ask, operators making upwards of 200k. Solo mole operators should be able to manage north of 300k an hour comfortably, and upwards of 400k an hour on a good day, while a slick, well-drilled crew should be able to hit the top end of this each if an equal split is applied. If you're comparing these rates with the good old days, then you might be on your way to sit with those traders still grumbling about the Laranite rush. But compared with other loops, mining still pays reasonably well, particularly for a loop that doesn't require any rep grind, and getting shot in the head isn't an everyday occupational hazard. Plus, I would generally argue that what various loops pay in Star Citizen right now isn't the most important thing. At some point the economy will be getting a full rebalance, and I think it's logical that heavy industrial gameplay has significant earning potential. The important thing for me is how skilled you are, how many times you've practiced this particular loop. So assuming you're still here, let's quickly go through the structure of this guide. First up, we're going to take a look at the new list of mineable commodities in order to get a better understanding of what we should be targeting and what we should be avoiding. Then we'll go through the various locations at which you'll find minables and which might be potential hot zones. We'll go on to look at the mining process itself through the lens of a few different strategies based on which ship you're using and whether you're operating solo or as part of a crew. Historically with my mining guides I've focused on solo, since if you could solo you could pretty easily adapt to multi-crew. But given the new significance of multi-crew, it's going to get its own section in this guide. Then finally, we'll take a look at the trade run, in which you'll haul your goods to market. So since the Quantanium only meta of the past is buried, that's going to make other commodities of interest to miners now. And this is a rough breakdown of the average prices for the different mineable commodities. As you can see, Quantanium is still king in terms of price, and it's actually become a lot more valuable than it was. But the downside is that its rarity has increased, and breaking Q rocks is now a lot harder than it was. So you're also going to want to pay particular attention to the new string of tier 1 metals, gold, taronite and bexolite. At prices north of 7k per SCU, these are on par with RMC and not far below where Quantanium used to stand at 8.8k per SCU. Also, for some mining strategies, you're going to want to keep an eye on the tier 2 metals that range in price from 2.7 to 4.4k per SCU. There have been some changes to all of the metals in this list, so even if you've mined before for a long time, just refresh your knowledge a bit. I've spent so long viewing things like beryl as total trash that I've almost had to do a double take to realise it's got reasonable value now. Of interest for other reasons are the tier 3 materials. These along with inert materials are ones that you want to avoid scooping up. Later in Star Citizen's development, I'd fully expect to see ships like the Orion, which will be able to turn a tidy profit even dealing in ores worth less than 1000 per SCU. But our current ships, the Prospector and the Mole, are highly constrained in terms of cargo capacity, and as such skilled miners should be highly selective about what they fill their saddlebags with. The more worthless or near worthless material you bring back, the less space there is for the good stuff. And some people might look at mats like titanium and say, well, it's still worth something, but to me it's an opportunity cost that devalues your average run. As well as prices, we should also be interested in the density, resistance and instability baseline stats of these materials. These are 3 key stats that dictate whether or not you can mine a rock. And as you can see, it's not a perfect line, but there is a strong correlation between the value of certain ores and their difficulty through these factors. Density in particular is a huge change to the mining system. Where before every type of ore had the same contribution to the mass of a rock, they now have different densities. Put very simply, 1 SCU of quartz is a far smaller mass number than 1 SCU of gold. So now we know what we're looking for, how about where we're going to find it? Well, this used to be an easy part of the guide, and now it's still an easy part of the guide, just in a very different way. Historically, miners would focus on very specific locations. Lyria, one of the moons of the ArcCorp planetary system, was renowned as the primo spot when it came to quant mining. But now, from what I can tell at least, you can mine on pretty much any moon in Stanton. On the planets Hurston and Microtech, in any of the Lagrange points, the Ring of Yella, and in the vast Aran Halo belt with a fair degree of success. The thing is that while Quantanium Tier 1 and Tier 2 materials are varying degrees of rare versus the common Tier 3 mats, the variance in terms of their rarity at a net level between different locations in the Stanton system is somewhat low. This is one potential area where maybe we just haven't found the holy grail spots yet, and identifying them may come in time. But for now I think we're faced with a trade-off between surface mining on moons and planets and asteroid mining in space. Each one has pluses and minuses. Asteroid mining is on balance a safer option. In the vastness of space, you're quite simply going to be harder to find. You're also going to be much more likely to escape would-be aggressors via a quick QT jump the moment you see other ships on your radar. Nowhere is this truer than out in the vastness of the Aran Halo asteroid field that rings the system between Crusader and ArcCorp. In order to navigate to this field, you'll need to plot a course from your starting location to another waypoint, and at a certain distance cut your QT travel, either by holding down B to cancel your jump, or by powering your ship down with U. Thankfully, the wonderful people over at Cornerstone have created extensive maps to help you navigate your way to the Halo from the majority of refinery stations where you're likely to be starting out. and they've even gone as far as surveying the different bands to give you an idea which dropout points offer the greatest density of asteroids. I'm going to include links to their page in the video description down below to help you. Meanwhile, surface mining on moons and planets is riskier since you're operating in a smaller, although still massive area. You're also more prone to getting jumped since you need to break atmo before you can QT away. And pretty much every combat-oriented ship is going to outperform a mining ship in this regard. However, based on our testing so far, it does appear that the density of mineable deposits seems to be higher on the surfaces, giving you more potential rocks to scout in a shorter amount of time. Distance is also a factor, with most moons being closer to the refineries than asteroid mining locations. And refinery stations themselves will also factor into your thinking when it comes to location. Whether you intend to sell your raw ore or increase the value of your runs by refining the materials, then one of these stations is likely to become your new home. There are space stations with refinery decks at 7 locations around Stanton: Arkel 1, Arkel 2, Herel 1, Herel 2, Mikel 1, Mikel 2, and Cruel 1. Each refinery provides bonus modifiers to certain materials, giving you either a positive or a negative on the yield that you receive from your job. Ultimately, while there are a ton of stats built into mining, a lot of it is about picking the important information out of the noise. So for example, I think you should pretty much ignore any of the modifiers to tier 3 materials. Their value's so low that I'd rarely recommend refining them anyway. The impact a refinery has on your tier 2 and higher mats is going to be far more important depending on your strategy. While I'd rarely make refinery bonuses the be-all and end-all of your location choices, I would note that for those seeking out high-value mats, Mikel 2 has one of the best balances on offer, with 9% bonuses on both Bexolite and Gold, a 1% bonus on Quantanium, and no negative impact on Taranite. Meanwhile, Cruel 1, the only refinery near the Crusader planetary system, has some pretty big negatives, seeing you lose 6% of your Gold and Bexolite hauls, along with 8% of your Tier 2 Laranite, and 2% of your Hephaestonite. It only offsets this with a 7% increase in Beryl, the least valuable of the Tier 2 materials. Keep in mind that at most locations you're going to have a choice of 2 refineries at pretty much equal distances. So once you've scooped up and filled your ship, it might be worth taking a look at the modifiers versus what's in your saddlebags, and making a decision on which refinery to head back to. I'm not sure that I'd recommend travelling any further than that just for these bonuses, since you'll eat more time than it's worth if you go too far out of your way. And when it comes time to sell, you don't want to have to traipse around again picking up all of your jobs. But let's just say I'd been working away at one of Hurston's moons, and I've managed to scoop up a mix of Gold and Bexolite. I'd probably opt to head back to Herel 2 rather than Herel 1 to benefit from the better modifiers. For those heading down planet side, another factor in choosing a location is going to be weather. This is going to be something to keep in mind regardless of the ship you're using, as even a mild breeze can force you into a drift, making it more difficult to maintain your laser on the rock. At some locations, such as the moons of Microtech, storms can get incredibly fierce. Weather is especially important though if you're trying to solo operate the mole, since doing so is going to force you to leave the pilot seat, making it a lot easier to drift in the wind. And for this reason, those operating a solo or partially crewed mole might want to consider asteroid mining over surface mining, or favour the 2 moons of ArcCorp, Lyria and Wala, where CIG haven't got round to adding weather just yet. The final consideration I'd make when choosing a location is the base metals specific to that locale. While I don't believe that you should make any decisions on the basis of the value of said metals, since I wouldn't waste cash or time hauling them by refining them anyway, I think you should consider their resistance attributes. Rocks tend to be made up of 2 or 3 materials, and typically where you find a tier 2 or higher mat that you may want, it will be accompanied by a base metal. The combined resistance values of the metals are used to determine the rock's overall resistance, with high resistance rocks being harder to get enough charge into to break. All things being equal, lower resistance will mean you can crack larger mass rocks, and larger mass rocks have more goodies inside them to fill your saddlebags with. Lower resistance from the base metals will also make a higher percentage of rocks with good materials viable for you to break, thus reducing down the time of each run. It's worth making special mention here of the moons around Hurston. On Ether and Magda, the only base metal is iron, which has a negative 40% resistance, while on Aerial, you're guaranteed to find rocks with either iron or quartz, which has a negative 70% effect. So in one way, I'm sorry that I can't just say go here, as I have in my previous guides. I hope this slice is revealing just how much deeper mining gameplay has become. And there's a hidden benefit to all of this too. Despite the fact that we're just looking to crack some rocks and get space rich, there are those in this open world who might wish to turn our hard work into their gain. Hello to all you pirates watching this vid to get the lowdown on where to ambush miners. As ever, I welcome your patronage, but bad news for you guys I'm afraid, good news for us. Because one of the big downsides of the quant mining Lyria or bust meta of the past was that there was only one place where we were going to be. And given that in prior patches Arkel 2 had a big negative modifier on refined Quantanium, there was only one refinery station that the majority of us called home at Arkel 1. So when considering your location, maybe keep these piratey types in mind. Man, Microtech's so far away is a phrase I hear a lot. Or maybe that's a good thing if you don't want to be disturbed. And maybe you should keep in mind that reprobates getting dumped out of the revolving door prison system we have in Stanton get dumped out at Everest Harbour in Hurston. I'm not saying don't go there, I'm just saying make informed decisions. Before we get into different builds, ships and strategies, let's take a moment to think about our personal loadout, because these recommendations are pretty staple across the board. First up, you'll want to ditch the noob suit and grab yourself a decent set of armour. Heavy will give you the best chance if you get boarded, but I like the trade-offs of medium. 1 because aerial armour looks cool, and 2 because it's worth keeping in mind that you do run around a lot as a miner, so the mobility debuff of heavy can slow you down. Being armoured up isn't that much use if you don't bring a firearm though. Even if you lose a gunfight versus pirates, there's no embarrassment in it, if you at least go down fighting. But to fight, you're going to need a gun. I'd also make sure that I've got med supplies. A med gun is a bonus, but at least a brace of med pens. Nothing sucks like randomly taking damage when moving around your ship and bleeding out for want of a 100 credit med pen. Similarly, if you want to sustain over time, you're going to want to grab some food and drink, or better yet, cruise because it does both. And finally, you're going to want to have at least a couple of mining gadgets on you now. Gadgets are a piece of mining equipment that you can equip to your person, and you can carry a couple of extras in a backpack. They've got a range of buffs to help you out cracking rocks, but the downside is that you need to physically leave your ship to attach and calibrate them. And then you'll need to leave your ship again if you want to go and recover them and not waste your money. While it might be a bit of a pain, in the new world these are really useful bits of kit, and they can make the difference between cracking a rock and not being able to. There's a number of gadget types, but the one I'm tending to use the most at the moment is the Sabir. I personally find that resistance is one of the most important stats in determining whether a crack is possible, and the Sabir offers the biggest resistance modifier at minus 50%. Other stats like green zone, instability, charge rates, etc. are nice to haves, but they're all kind of meaningless if you don't have the ability to get charge into the rock and crack it. One that we're still experimenting with a bit is the Optimax, since it gives a buff to cluster modifier, a factor you can only affect through gadgets. This should theoretically help to force materials to clump together, giving you more high percentage pieces of the bits that you want. However, it's one that we're fairly sure isn't working fully as intended, since the base metals which form a decent percentage of most rocks already have a very high cluster rate. Increasing the cluster rate through a modifier can ironically then have unintended consequences of spreading the base metals out more, not less. So for this next part of the guide, I'm going to break down a few different mining strategies for various types of players. First, we're going to look at solo prospector mining, since through this lens we can cover a lot of the basics of scouting for and cracking rocks. Then we'll scale things up and take a look at soloing the mole, and then finally we'll take a look at multi-crewing moles. On each one of these we'll look at my current recommended build, but as with many things in this guide, keep in mind that they're still a work in progress. I do want to make another quick note on builds as well, because in each case I'm going to talk about a potentially optimal build, but then I might highlight some modifications I'd make from a more practical perspective. This largely comes down to an issue with modules. Modules can be equipped to mining lasers, and they come in two varieties, consumable and permanent. Both give buffs and debuffs to various stats that affect your ability to mine rocks. Consumables can be activated to give your lasers these effects for a limited duration. They also have a limited number of uses before they burn out and need to be replaced. That said, they are decidedly cheaper than permanent mods. These are always on though, when they attach to your laser, and they never run out. However, and this is a big however, if you overcharge a rock and take even a slight bit of damage to your ship, or if you're marginally within the danger zone when you're breaking a rock, then in the current build at least, the modules are liable to fall off. We aren't sure if this is intentional design or if the new changes to allow component swapping brought in with 319 are causing these things to detach extremely easily. There is a chance for you to scrabble around on the floor finding your lost mods, but I'd liken this exercise to finding a contact lens on a football pitch. So essentially, even though I might like to recommend some optimal builds, you might want to tone these things down and not invest quite so much cash in modules that you might not come back with. So with all that said, let's start out with our first strat, the Solo Prospector. The Prospector is a true SC workhorse made by Musashi Interstellar Starflight Concern, or MISC. It's the dedicated solo miner of the verse. The pilot can control both the ship and its size 1 laser from their seat, allowing you to remain under more control, able to run from pirates or pull away from an angry overcharged rock. The downside to the Prospector versus its big brother, the Argo Mole, is its more limited cargo capacity at 32 SCU versus the Mole's 96. It also has a size 1 QT drive, meaning travel times over the distances we're mostly looking at here are slower than the Mole's size 2. For my Prospector build, I'd grab an Atlas drive to give you a speed bump versus the stock Goliath. Then I'd look at picking up a Klein S1 as a replacement laser head for the stock Arbor. The 319 patch offers a lot more variety than we had at any point prior, where basically the only game in town was the Lancet laser. So I would really encourage you to experiment with different options. The Arbor, for example, is actually a really good starter laser, and nowadays, rental Prospectors are actually viable. The Arbor gives you big buffs to instability in the green zone of rocks, making them much easier to crack. But its downsides include relatively low power and a debuff causing increased resistance, meaning you're not going to be cracking the bigger rocks. Similarly, I'd highlight the Impact, which is effectively a more advanced Arbor. The buffs and debuffs follow the same pattern, they're just all toned down a bit, meaning you can crack potentially larger rocks, but the training wheels are off a bit. I favour the Klein though, which I would regard as something of an advanced laser, with a huge minus 45% buff to resistance. Combined with reasonable laser power, I've found that this laser can crack some of the biggest rocks that I've personally managed to solo. I also get a nice 20% buff to the green zone, but I am contending with a 35% increase in instability. If you like the idea but don't want to go quite so far, then the Hofstadter could be a good middle ground. Like with the Arbor and the Impact, the Klein and the Hofstadter are cut from the same cloth. The Hofstadter's minus 30% to resistance isn't so much of a buff, but its 10% increase to instability isn't so much of a debuff. Theoretically, with its significant power and minus 30% resistance buff, the Helix laser could crack the largest stones out there. However, its minus 40% optimal charge window debuff leaves a lot of valuable rocks with only the tiniest sliver of a window. And I think that by going down this route, even the most professional miners are going to make mistakes. Just to round out this list, since we've talked about every other laser, I'll just say rest in peace Lancet laser, rest in peace. As of 319, the different lasers have different numbers of module slots, and the Klein size one has a slight downside in that it has no module slots, so the laser is all we really need to cover in this build. While it's a curse, it's also a blessing though, since in this instance I don't need to talk about optimal and practical builds, and no modules means no modules to risk losing. So now that we've got all of that sorted, I finally accept that it's time to actually go mining. I know that was an awful lot of preparation, but I am a big believer in the 7Ps. So I'm someone who likes to break things down. I figure when I'm trying to maximize my efficiency and returns, it's best to look at a problem in small parts rather than a big whole. So I think about the mining loop as the mining cycle. And we'll talk about each stage here with a few tips about saving time or improving efficiency along the way. And first up is the launch. Basically, this just covers everything from getting to your ship to getting to a location where you can mine. And I know a lot of people will look at this and say, wow, is he really being a patronizing git and telling me how to fly my ship out of a hangar? Well, yes. Essentially, everything in mining is about time. If you want to hit your highest earnings potential, that means saving time wherever you can. Quicker runs equals more money per hour. So if you can, develop a solid routine for your launch that you commit and save to muscle memory. And if it shaves even 20 to 30 seconds off your time, then that time saved is going to compound over multiple runs. So as soon as I get to the pilot's chair, I hit my call ATC keybind. Default for that is just left alt and N. That gets the hangar doors moving, and then I'm firing up my ship and opening up my star map with F2. I'm going to plot in my course for my chosen mining ground, so in this run I'm going to head to Daymar, so I'll set a course for Crusader first. Hit B to open the quantum drive and get it spooling, and then take a look to orient myself with the direction of the first jump. This way you're going to know when to turn as soon as you get out of the hangar. Boost out of the hangar as soon as the doors are open and align with that first jump, then punch it. Now at this point you can settle back and take some screenshots if you like, or you can, if you're heading to a moon like I am, save a bit more time. So if I'd plotted a course straight for Daymar itself, then the computer would have plotted a 2-stage jump, first to Crusader and then to Daymar. However, if I watch my ship entering the outermost ring of the planetary system, the orbit line of the moon Yella here, I can cut my jump by holding down B again. And now that I'm within the boundaries of the Crusader system, I can cancel the rest of the jump onwards to Crusader and plot a course straight for Daymar. Then head down there as soon as my drive's just cooled down. If you're not doing this part yet, then just that alone is going to save you those 20 to 30 seconds. Once you reach the moon, you're going to want to target one of the ground locations, and just keep in mind that a solid outline indicates the location is on the same side of the moon as you are currently, while a dotted outline will mean it's on the other face and you'll jump around the moon to get there. I personally prefer the convenience of being able to see the ground and avoid flying into it, so I'll pick a location more in the sun. So now that we're on location, the next phase of the cycle is scouting, finding something worth breaking apart and filling our saddlebags with. The key decision you're going to have to make as part of your strategy is which materials you will deem worthwhile, and which you're going to leave behind and continue searching for better. Set that bar too low, and you're going to suffer poor returns on your hauls. But set the bar too high, and you might go on scouting for a very long time while passing up plenty of opportunities to bank something. In my solo prospector strategy, I recommend going for anything from the tier 2 list, and viewing tier 1 materials as a nice bonus when you do stumble across them in a rock that you can mine alone. I've experimented over a number of runs with holding out purely for tier 1 rocks. I found that solo in a prospector I was taking too much time finding spawns that were low enough mass for me to get enough power into. While the returns I was getting per run were higher, the time I was taking comparatively meant I was making less over the course of a session than when I was being a bit less picky. The method we use to actually find rocks though is scanning, so we start by letting out a ping, default key here is tab, and this will give you returns for minables in a bubble around your ship. We then want to open the scanning mode with V and dial up the intensity a little bit by rolling up on the mouse wheel. When we hold the crosshairs over one of these returns, we get our first bit of useful data, the RS signature. So mineable rocks each have an RS signature of between 1700 and 1950, depending on their type. As we learn more, the different types of rock will probably show to have higher percentage chances of spawning the materials that we want, but based on the experience we've built up so far, it doesn't seem to make enough of a difference to dismiss certain rock types and focus on checking others. What I do focus on though is clusters. I avoid travelling to solo rocks, ones with signals which are purely 1700, 1950, and I focus instead on larger multiples of that which indicate groups of rocks. My thinking is that travelling to, slowing down and moving on from rocks all takes time. I know I'm a broken record going on about time at this point. So if I'm going to invest that time, it's better to have more than one rock to check. Another thing I want to avoid is gem deposits. These are rock minables and are going to be useless for us in a prospect or a mole, so we don't want to waste time checking these. While gems do have a different RS signature to rocks and you can do a bit of mental gymnastics to work out which is which, there are a couple of rules of thumb which are just easier than that. So first, gems will generate a return only at closer ranges. As you're pinging, if you notice a return pop up within 4 to 5 kilometers for the first time, then that's likely to be gems rather than rocks, which generate returns from over 10 kilometers out. Also, if you're not sure, you can narrow your ping to a tight angle of 2 to 5 degrees, and ping that spot again. The white diamonds are the gems or the rocks, and gems will be much closer together than rocks, so look out for these really tight clusters to know which ones to ignore, and look for ones which are a bit more spread out to know that they're good rocks to go and see. When you're moving between different clusters of rocks, it helps to have your scanning angle at 180 degrees, because this just keeps the scanning bubble in front of you. It doesn't help if you're setting it to 360 degrees, because you can get a bit confused with things which are behind you that maybe you've already scanned, and you can end up turning yourself around and going over old ground. It's better to pick a direction and stick in it, ideally even using a landmark or a visual cue to know that you're heading in one direction. Also, a little piece of advice for folks who really want to push their earnings is to not be too sedate just because you're in a mining ship. To some extent, drive it like you stole it. Dial up the speed, max your thrusters on the power triangle, and be prepared to boost through your turns, helping you get aligned to returns quicker. When it comes to looking at what's actually in these rocks, in the Prospector I really like to just use the mining laser itself. Press M to switch to mining mode and bring the laser out and then simply hover it over a rock and it will scan passively. The new mining HUD with 3.19 is actually a really nice upgrade. It sets out the data in a much more easy to read, user-friendly manner. And over on the right hand side you're going to see the scan results. So here we've got an obsidian deposit, its mass is 9,799, resistance of 23%, instability of 2.73%. Just below that we've got the guide on whether or not we should try cracking this rock. And I would emphasize that it's a guide because sometimes it does tell lies. These will rate rocks as either easy, medium, hard, challenging, or, as is this case, impossible. A little below that we've got the composition of the rock. So we've got 57% laranite, 32% copper, 12% inert materials. So this is a reasonably good rock, with laranite being one of those tier 2 materials that we're after as part of this strategy. What I don't quite agree with though is the impossible rating that it's been given. One of the things I think it's not quite keeping up with is the actual impact of your laser, your modules. So if you've got something like the Klein laser that I'm using here, which is going to reduce our resistance a lot, it's sometimes worth just giving rocks like this a bit of a go. It doesn't take you that long to just try them out and get a feel for which rocks your laser can and cannot crack. Now I know that I'm willing to sort of try every rock which is up to about 12k mass with a decent level of resistance like this one is. And if I've got rocks which have a very low resistance, then I'm willing to try up to 15-16k mass just to see if they'll budge. What I ignore though are rocks which are much larger than that, so things over 20k I know I don't really stand much chance of, so I don't waste any time on them. Similarly, I don't spend very much time looking at very, very small mass rocks, particularly if these are only containing tier 2 materials. While that laranite rock is pretty nice and I might come back to it, I would also look around a bit in the cluster before I start cracking. The thing is that one of these rocks might contain more valuable materials than what I've just identified. So if one of these was tier 1, I would prioritize that ahead of that tier 2 laranite rock. It's just mostly about thinking about your time and your Prospector's saddlebags. You've only got 32 SCU, so try for the most valuable rock you can find in a cluster first. As it is though, there isn't anything more valuable, so I think we're going to head to the cracking phase and take a look at smashing that laranite rock. So I activate my laser just by left mouse button, and I'm going to move in a bit closer to this rock. And it's interesting that as soon as it's identified the resistance modifier of my Klein laser, it's actually dropped from impossible to hard, and I can instantly see the charge level going into the rock. Over on the left hand side of the HUD, I've got an idea of which range I should be setting at. I want to move within the optimal zone, but not move within the danger zone. Within that yellow hazard lined danger zone, if I crack the rock, even if it's a perfect break, I'm going to take some damage. You control the laser intensity by holding left alt and rolling with the mouse wheel. That's a bit of a change for 3.19 as well. but it allows you control over your speed limiter on your ship, as well as control over your laser intensity. I want to dial it up as I creep closer to the green zone, but then I want to start paring it back before I hit there and finding a level where I can comfortably hold the charge level where it is. I shouldn't be trying to ride the green zone, shouldn't be trying to get it as high in the green zone as possible. There's no benefit, it charges at the same rate regardless of where exactly you've got the intensity positioned within that window. One thing which I do see new players do quite a lot is moving the laser around, drawing diagrams on the rock. You don't really want to do this, you just want to focus your beam in one area, because moving it around can change the different laser intensity. Different areas of the rock are sometimes weak points. You want to find a point where you're getting charge into the rock, and then aim to just limit that as a variable. You don't want to be moving around the amount of charge that you've got going in. And soon enough, we've got ourselves a nice clean break. So one other change which has come up with 3.19 is that there are a lot of rocks now which only require one split. They don't require any secondary breaks. Where you see a purple outline, you can immediately start scooping that. So right click to change to extraction mode, and I'm going to start scooping any high percentage pieces of laranite that I find in this. Just hovering your crosshairs over a piece will scan it, and again you can take a look at the component materials. This is again a question of where do you set your bar. Because if you want to stick to just 100% pieces, you might have to break more rocks before you fill your cargo hold. But if you set the bar too low again, and you start taking bits which are sort of containing a lot of other inert materials or the base metals, then you're going to fill your saddlebags up too quickly, and you're going to end up going back with a lot of rubbish. I find a nice balance is for tier 2 materials, I tend to take things in the high 70s over 80%. And for tier 1 materials, I'd be a little bit less picky, I'd probably take things over 50%. Over time, I might refine this strategy. This is still something I'm very much experimenting with, and I'd encourage you to do the same and find what's most successful for you. Something you can do to make yourself a little bit quicker is get an idea of the different resistance and instability of the pieces that you're looking for. So for instance, on laranite, it's resistance 50%, instability 4. This just means that you can start scooping before it's finished actually telling you that it's laranite. So at the end of that crack, I've got myself 16.5 SCU of laranite, so I'm just over half full, and I've taken on about half an SCU of copper as well. So with that, it's time to just start scanning again and look for the next good thing to mine. As a nice bonus on this run, I found myself a small bexelite rock as well. So because this is tier 1 rather than tier 2, I'll be a little bit more tolerant of picking up less pure pieces, because the bexelite itself is worth significantly more than say the laranite or the borate I've got in my hold so far. One thing I did want to just do, just to show that it is possible and how resistance plays a really big part alongside mass, is I did want to just take on this 16.5k mass Hephaestonite and copper rock. Hephaestonite is one of the tier 2 materials with very low resistance, and copper is also a negative resistance modifier. So despite the fact that it was saying impossible, my client was able to make pretty short work of this. Once your cargo hold's full, it's time to return to base. And the one key thing here is to avoid being predictable. The most effective way to survive a pirate attack is to not get caught in the first place. A common piracy strategy is to interdict industrial players in dead space on commonly trafficked trade lanes, but the mantis which they'll use to do this has a relatively small bubble, so to avoid falling for this trick, add a dogleg jump. Rather than heading back to Crew L1, I'd look to line up a jump to an alternate destination. So let's start a jump towards Crew L5 instead. It won't take very long to get off the main shipping lane between Crusader and Crew L1. So after you've travelled for a bit, maybe 500,000, 1 million kilometers, just cut the jump drive by holding down B again, and then redirect yourself to the refinery at Crew L1. Once you drop out of the refinery, dial up your speed and make for the safety of the hangars. It's pretty easy to switch off at this point, but there's always a risk since you're at a bottleneck. This is one of the areas that other players are going to know what others are going to pass through. Once I'm safe and sound inside the station, I tend to make a habit of storing the ship. This just means that when you get it out again, it will be turned around and facing the right way. There's also always a risk that a server crash at exactly this moment could lead to your ship coming up as location unknown and you could be forced into a claim, losing your cargo. But inside the station, it will be safe. Head to the inner transit elevators and head on down to the refinery deck. Go up these stairs where you're going to find 2 sets of terminals. These ones here allow you to sell raw to the refinery. You'll get roughly 50% of their refined value. On the upside, it doesn't cost you anything to do, and you can sell everything including the base metals that might not be worth refining. But over here are the refining kiosks, which allow you to set up a job and turn your raws into processed mats. First, you're going to want to select your ship, in this case our Prospector, from the drop-down menu, and then we can select Setup Work Order. Next, you're going to want to select all of the materials you want to refine. Now again, there's going to be an element of personal preference here. Some people will want to refine everything that they can, including the base metals. I, however, leave the tier 3 commodities out of my refinery orders. They're worth very little at the point of sale, but you are still going to have to ship them. And this means more boxes, which means overall more shipping runs with your goods, and that means more time. Secondly, having more mats to refine does make the job cost more. It's all fairly marginal in the context of Tier 2, Tier 1 and Quantanium, but refinery costs do eat up a fair whack of what Tier 3 mats are worth. So here I'm going to select my gold and my beryl, and I'm just going to leave the inert materials, the titanium and the iron ore to just disappear into the ether. And now you're ready to select a refining process from the drop-down menu. All refinery processes are a trade-off between yield, how much of your raw ore gets lost in the process, time and cost. I always recommend prioritizing yield over all else, closely followed by cost. This is one situation where time doesn't matter, since the time in this instance is passive. The process occurs when you're asleep, working away at your real job, or more productively, going out on more mining runs. Yield and cost, however, are going to have knock-on impact to how profitable you are, so I generally prefer the high-yield, low-cost process Linux solventation, where I keep roughly 85% of my mats and the price is de minimis. The trade-off here though is time. This Prospector load won't be ready to collect until about a day's time. But as I said, in this instance this doesn't really matter. One other process I do consider and use from time to time is Ferrin Exchange. This is one of the other high yield options, but it's a fair bit quicker for roughly twice the cost of Linux. I use this situationally, particularly if I've taken a crew out in the mole and I'm keen to get them their cash more promptly, or if I've got a bunch of other jobs finishing in the not too distant future and I want to cram one more in for the trade run. Once you've selected your process, click on Get Quote where you'll see the values, and just click to log the job. So from that particular run with our 2020 beryl and 292 gold, after our refining costs of 4,237, we're going to be looking at a payoff of roughly 74k. This isn't too bad, but the run which we did, which included more Bexalite and Borace earlier, that one would have clocked about 82,000. So it's interesting to note that these runs are taking me an average of 21 to 24 minutes at the moment. My goal really is to aim for a 75 to 80,000 credit run every 20 minutes. That's where I'm working towards. And that's where I think that if we can get it within those ranges, we'll be able to do 3 runs in an average hour, and then we'll be able to push Prospector mining above 200k an hour. So with that in mind, it's time to chug a cruise to refresh those food and drink meters, and then it's time to head out to find more rocks to crack. But what about the mole? Can it still be soloed? Well, yes, is the simple answer. And in this next section, we're going to look at my solo mole strategy. But in order to remain somewhat respectful of your time, I'm going to not go through every single aspect again. The general rules of the mining cycle are the same regardless of which ship you use. So instead we're going to focus on the differences. First up is the build. Unlike the Prospector, the mole is obviously not designed to be a solo ship. The name is literally Multi-Operator Laser Extractor. However, alongside the enhanced cargo capacity, there are two key advantages the mole offers to solo players. Number one is the option to fit bigger lasers. The Prospector takes size 1s while the mole can fit size 2 lasers. And size 2s have, for the most part, identical buffs and debuffs to their size 1 counterparts, but they have more power and an extra module slot versus the smaller lasers. More power typically means you can crack bigger rocks. And number 2 is versatility. So as a solo player, you're only going to be able to use one laser at a time. You can come equipped with 3 to choose from, allowing you to have more options on the fly depending on the situation you're in. So for my mole build, I stick with the Klein laser, this time the S2, in my primary turret 1 slot. This turret's the one that sits directly under the bridge and it's the quickest for the pilot to access. The S2 already has more power than the S1, but since we've also got a module slot now, we can add even more through a Riga C3. It's a bit of a risk given the 60k cost, so as I mentioned in the beginning, you might want to tone this down a bit. But it's my go-to since it gives me 25% more power while only sacrificing 1% of the green zone. Laser 2 is the second quickest to access since it's on the right hand side of the mole next to the ladder. And this I'm still experimenting with a little bit, but I've had some good results downsizing this laser to take a Hofstede size 1. One of the areas in which the Klein struggles is in secondary brakes due to its instability. The Hofstede one, however, gives some of the most control with the lowest minimum power out of all of the lasers. It also continues to provide resistance buffs, and while the instability debuff is still present, it's not quite as bad as with the Klein. Given its role in this build, I'm adding a Focus 3 module to enhance the green zone by 40%. This does mean a 5% drop in laser power, but I'm hoping this laser will be working on smaller mass chunks anyway. And solo, I haven't yet found the perfect third laser. After some of the experimentation I did while recording this guide though, I'm leaning maybe towards a Hofstede size 2 in this slot for a larger secondary or smaller primary brakes. It's got 2 slots, so I could add 2 Focus 3s for an extra large green zone, or I could balance out the negative impact of the Focus by pairing a Riga C3 and a Focus 3 together. As you can see from this build though, things can get expensive fast. And if I were to do all this, we'd be looking at 200 to 300,000 credits worth of modules. Modules that would need to be rebought if we had any accidents, or if we were to come under attack and get bricked by pirates. That sort of money could pretty easily send us into the red for a mining run, and leave a bit of a sour taste in the mouth. So with that in mind, I would encourage you to consider some alternatives in the cheaper consumable space. Surge, for example, provides temporary buffs of -10% to resistance and 35% to laser power, at the cost of a 10% decrease in instability. And this can be really useful for more quickly getting a charge going in a rock, saving you time letting it heat up. Lifeline, with its temporary decrease in instability and resistance, can also be useful when making tough breaks, as can the Torpid module with its 60% increase in optimal charge window rate, and 60% decrease in catastrophic charge rate. Also keep in mind that just because you have 3 lasers doesn't mean you need to use all of them. And when operating solo, you can very easily view the mole as just a big prospector, and purely kit out a single laser with your preferred setup, limiting the amount of credits you're risking during each run. In terms of quantum drive, it's an easy choice on the mole though. You've got the option for a size 2 and the tanks to back it up, so go grab yourself an XL1 and enjoy a much faster trip to and from the mining fields. To demonstrate my solo mole strat, I'm going to head to Lyria just for old time's sake. As mentioned in the earlier segment on location, the moons of ArcCorp are going to be a preferred destination for those seeking to avoid the elements. No wind or pesky storms to blow us off course when we leave the pilot's seat here. The essence of this strat is very similar to the solo Prospector. I'm on the lookout for tier 2 and higher, and I view tier 1 or Quantanium that I can mine solo as a total bonus. I prioritise clusters over single rocks even more diligently in the mole, as it's bigger, less manoeuvrable, and takes a lot more time and more fuel to slow down and speed up again. The great thing about taking this approach, though, is that it takes barely any time to find something worth mining. And in the first cluster, I hit a good couple of tier 2 Laranite rocks, and the ultimate kicker, a quant rock that is actually within my window of opportunity. I would never go out specifically just looking for this now. The chances of finding it if I was going to limit my target to just this is so low that I'll probably spend all of my time flying around in the mole. But if it's there for the taking, then I'm definitely going to take it. So the key thing to remember about Quantanium is that once you scoop it, you're on a timer before it explodes, and you can kiss your saddlebags, if not your ship, goodbye. So since I know this Q rock is by no means going to fill me up, I would prioritise cracking the larger of the laranite rocks first. At 15k mass, this is towards the top end of my range solo, particularly since laranite has that pretty high resistance of 50%. So I'll slap a severe gadget onto the rock to get that down a bit. To save a bit of time fiddling around with the elevator, keep in mind that you can always exit the ship via the front of the side turrets. To use a mining gadget, make sure it's equipped to the slot on your back and access it by cycling your utility keybind, default is 4 on the keyboard, until you get it into your hands. Attach it to the rock by holding down left mouse button when in range, and then hold F and interact with the 3 sliders to calibrate it. You're looking to get this figure in the bottom right over 90%. The gadgets aren't perfect just yet, and sometimes the slider interactions aren't perfectly aligned because of the weirdness of the rock. So drag your cursor around and look for the buttons changing colour. When you're over 90%, hit the activate button to start up the gadget, and then get back to your ship. Positioning in the mole is all important, since you have to leave the pilot's seat to get to the mining laser. So if you get down there to find that you're off, you'll have to head back up. You don't want to be directly over the top of the rock because of the rotational limits of the turret, and instead want to face it head on with a bit of elevation. Look down through your feet with your free look key to see your distance to the rock. Optimal range for my climb 2 is from about 60 to 80 meters, but just bear in mind that the laser itself is about 5 meters closer to the rock than the pilot's seat once you factor in that it's below you and that the cab extends. Jump out of the pilot's seat and head to this ladder down, and by backing down the ladder you can pay a few HP points to jump down instead of dealing with the ladder animation. Style bonus if you catch the ladder before the bottom and avoid the damage. Quick video editing segue here, because when I got into my turret during this run it was already on, and one big rule of mole mining is that you never ever turn off the turret. One of the most long-standing bugs in Star Citizen is that for some reason if you power off a mole laser turret you power down the whole ship and you fall out of the sky. So I couldn't at this point show you where to turn it on. So once you hop in the seat, let the extension animation play out and then hold F and reach up to this spot. It's a little bit to the right of the center point between the MFDs. Here you'll find the power on, and you can just click that to turn the laser on. So back to this rock. Actual laser operation in the mole is identical to the Prospector. Find your spot where you start to get a charge and avoid wiggling around. Just let the charge build, then pair back to hold it in the green zone until the break. The secondary brakes here were a little tricky, but nothing I couldn't handle with a little feathering. This is where you're just going to turn off and on the laser, and keep in mind that the trade-off of all that extra power in the size 2 laser is more minimum power, so be careful not to push things too far. You can add these little stabs to keep yourself just touching the green zone and that charge building, and if it does ever go over and into the red, just remember to exhibit some patience. It's better to let the rock cool all the way down than it is to break it with any red in it. If this is getting a little bit too difficult, that is where, the second laser might be more appropriate. And that's the big advantage of the mole here. We can bring something which makes these secondary brakes easier. And if I needed to, I could go and use that Hofstede. Because I know I'm going to go on and grab that quant rock, I was quite picky about the laranite chunks that I picked up here, but I did still manage to grab 31 SCU of pure with only a small amount of dirt. So once I was done, I stopped to scoop up my gadget, I placed it onto the Quantanium rock and repositioned. I considered my positioning quite a lot here. I've made sure that I'm in between the Q rock and another laranite rock that I might as well crack too while I'm here. I've turned myself slightly to the left, This is to ensure that I have access to these rocks with my Hofstede on the right hand side of the ship as well as through the central laser with my Klein. I made the crack of the small laranite rock to begin with, so that that's just ready to scoop up, but I'll leave it there broken for now. After I'm done with the quant, I can then just fill up on that one before I go. And then, despite its relatively high resistance, with the combined negative resistance plus of my Klein and the Sabir, I was able to make fairly short work of this quant rock. An important rule when dealing with quant is to leave scooping any until absolutely last. Perform any secondary breaks that you need to before you scoop a single gram, since as soon as you have any quantanium on board, your timer will start immediately. And some of these breaks, particularly of the smaller mass pieces, were a bit too tricky with the Klein, so I switched to the Hofstede one instead. You don't want to be doing all of this moving around if you're ticking against a clock. And I think when making guides, it's important to call attention to your mistakes rather than just editing them out, since these are going to happen when you're doing this for real. I strongly recommend taking the time to scan every rock once they're broken, so that you know the order of priority in which you're going to scoop, and so you don't miss any secondary breaks you need to make. I was maybe in a bit too much of a hurry trying to do this run on my lunch break, and I missed this shard which contained 45% quant. I'd already started scooping and the 25 minutes were ticking down. I had volatile quant on board that I would lose if I overcharged the rock. I gave this piece a few tries to judge how difficult it was going to be. I ultimately decided that attempting it wasn't really worth the time or the risk. Sometimes the certainty of what's in your hold already is worth more than squeezing that extra bit in. I am, of course, still a little bit salty though. Ultimately, I scooped the quant that I could, which gave me a nice bonus of 8 SCU of that, and then I filled up the cargo hold with the laranite rock that I cracked earlier. And honestly, this is something I love about the new mining system. Previously, I would have never had any interest in cracking that laranite rock. Quant was so plentiful and prevalent that I would have just cracked the Q rock and nothing else, got that back to the refinery, and then come back out to mine more Q. So when it came to the return, I did a quick consultation of my refinery modifiers, and I noticed that despite the fact that I've based myself primarily out of Arkel 1, Arkel 2 offers the same 3% bonus to Quantanium, and avoids the -2% to Laranite, so I'm going to head there instead. Still, not directly there. Even when you're against the clock for Quantanium, it's still important to dogleg those jumps and reduce your risk of getting caught. As long as you waited until the end to scoop, there's plenty of time to recover your gadget and dogleg your jump. Particularly now the timer for Quantanium is 25 minutes, not 15. I did all of this and I still arrived at Arkel 2 and parked in my hangar without even getting a yellow warning light to let me know I was running out of time. All in all, this run took 46 minutes from start to finish. Thanks particularly to the quant I found, will net me over 280k once the job is complete. Minus 10k or so for refinery fees using Dinix, that's still a tidy 270k profit. Of course, not every run is going to include Quantanium, but one thing I have found is that the mole's higher laser power has meant I can crack more rocks, particularly more tier 1 rocks, become viable. And having that extra cargo capacity makes a really big difference. Over the course of a number of runs in the PU and PTU, my solo mole runs have averaged about 275k in 40 minutes after refining fees. So if you can maintain that sort of rate, then you should be looking at north of 400k an hour, even after factoring in cargo runs, assuming you have a decent sized ship. That being said, if you want to be a bit more cautious on your build given the module risk, you might need to tone this expectation down a little bit. And finally, for our strategies, we're going to take a look at multi-crew, because nowadays there are plenty of rocks out there that you can't manage alone. One question I can foresee is, will multiple prospectors still work? And the answer to this is kinda. For really efficient multiplayer mining, you want them all, since multiple prospectors suffer a debuff where each additional ship on a rock causes a doubling of instability, whereas multiple lasers from the same mole suffer no such debuff. This can get pretty out of hand pretty quickly if you're not careful. However, I will make a quick side note that if you're prepared to coordinate with a friend, 2 prospectors is still viable. The one thing I would recommend here is avoiding both going for the Klein, since it has a pretty awful instability debuff that you're only going to end up compounding. I'd probably recommend that either you both use Hofstedes, or that you maybe combine one climb with an impact to really synergize the benefits. Instead here I'm going to focus mostly on running a mole with a crew of 4, since this lets you go anywhere in the system to mine, since you don't have to worry about weather with somebody in the pilot seat. You could also get all 3 lasers available with 3 of you by either focusing on space mining or by hitting up the weatherless Arccorp moons. Build-wise, there's obviously a lot of flexibility, and unlike in the solo mole, you can think about how your lasers will synergize. Also keep in mind that there are rocks out there that even a fully crewed mole cannot crack alone, that will require multiple rolls. So there really isn't an upward ceiling where you have quote-unquote enough power. With these particularly juicy big rocks in mind, I'm currently favouring 2 Klein S2s to provide a massive minus 90% to resistance. I add Riga C3s to both of these for the extra juice. I'm a little wary of the rising instability though, and need at least one laser that offsets this to some degree. So I'm leaning towards using an Impact 2. It does increase resistance by 10%, but it also offsets some of the insta with a minus 10% buff. This leaves our baseline at minus 80% resistance and plus 65% instability. The Impact also benefits from 3 mod slots, so to make life a bit easier and counter all that instability, I've opted to widen the green zone by sacrificing some of my power on this laser for 2 focus 3s, adding 40% each to the green. If you combine that with the 20% offered by every laser in this build, our target area gets 140% larger with all the lasers active. To offset the power drop, I've added a Riga C3 to this laser as well. Again though, a word of caution is required. This build puts not only 260,000 credits at risk, but also your friendships. If you're the type of person to get mad at your mates because they overcooked a rock and cost you your modules, maybe don't equip them in the first place. XTR XLs don't have the power benefits of the Rigas, but they only cost 25k each, so you could stack these on all of your lasers and widen the green zone by 125%. Or 185% when combined with the lasers effects, and that'll only set you back 125k. Or you could experiment with the cheap consumables instead and ditch the permanent mods altogether and the accompanying risk. Just stick with the XL1 for your quant drive and you're good to go. Now more crew equals more power and more buffs, but it also means more mouths to feed. I'm a strong believer in equal splits after the associated costs of mining, so you're going to have to make sure it's worth your while. And for this reason, when running with a multi-crew, I would target tier 1 materials and start ignoring the tier 2s. Since you have more power, you have far more viable rocks. Tier 1 mats aren't particularly hard to find as a Prospector pilot or a solo mole operator. The issue is that you'll find them in high mass rocks that you don't have enough power to crack with only one laser. And one thing I would encourage you to do, if you're in the mining game to get rich that is to make sure your crewmates are all working for their dinner, or if you're the crew, make sure you're pulling your weight. If everyone on your crew is just here to chill out, swap jokes and have a laugh, there's absolutely nothing wrong with all piling into the mole, taking turns piloting and scanning and just making a good evening of it. If you're a filthy min-maxer like me, then this is offensively inefficient. It only takes one of you to fly the mole, and as a scouting ship, it is cumbersome. Instead, I would get all of my turret operators to fly smaller, more nimble ships and scout ahead of the mole, helping us to cover more than 3 times as much ground. Additionally, each crew member can be carrying a couple of gadgets, so that when they find something good and everyone else is converging on them, they can be attaching the gadget to the rock ready. Then simply land your ships a sensible distance away from the rock, hop on board the mole and get cracking. In previous patches, we didn't have to contend with the new minimum power of lasers, and there was quite a simple method to buddy mining where someone would act as the support laser, turning their laser on at 0% to add their buffs without actually contributing power. This loophole is closed with 319's minimum power, so what I would encourage you to do as a crew is to build up a system of layering your lasers one at a time on the rock, then building power up laser by laser. This will help you get a good idea of when the charge level starts to build and therefore where you'll need to pair it back to when the time comes. Communication is incredibly important, particularly when it comes to secondary breaks that may require 2 lasers to coordinate feathering to maintain a charge level in the green zone. Make sure that one of the laser operators is clearly designated as the lead. They can see what's going on and they can provide other operators with clear instructions. Decide ahead of time what you're going to say if in a pinch you want someone to cut their laser power entirely, or if you need to tell the pilot to get the hell out of Dodge because things have gone awry. As the pilot, try your best not to backseat drive even if it is your ship. Multi-crewing the mole now takes timing that it never did before. So make sure you've got at least one laser operator you can trust to lead the group, and then sit back and sip your tea while keeping one hand ready to boost up and away. And to me, this is incredibly exciting, and it's really the pinnacle of the changes to mining in 3.19. We're still very much in the learning phases, but I believe that with practice we should be able to average 500 to 600k from a multi-crew mole run in about half an hour, therefore putting our hourly average in the 1 to 1.2 million credit range. More if we find some juicy quant rocks. So the payouts on offer from multi-crewing are at least competitive with the top end of solo mining. It's just so much more challenging and rewarding to be able to do this sort of thing as part of a group. And with rocks like this absolute monster 120k mass Quantanium rock that we found recently on Walla, there are even good reasons out there to run sizable operations. This particular rock took the combined efforts of 7 lasers across 2 moles and a prospector to tackle, and it was honestly worth it just for the cheers that went up when it cracked. Which is a pretty good job because we subsequently overcooked one of the secondaries and we blew most of the cash return away. And finally, when all is said and done, regardless of how you went about your mining, it's going to come time to cash it all in. And to do that, you're going to need to make a run to the TDD in a cargo ship. This is going to seem obvious now to all the experienced miners with their cruise-stained beards and their singed eyebrows, but it's not so obvious to newer mining enthusiasts. Mining ships like the Prospector and the Mole only have carrying capacity for raw ores. They do not have space in them for the refined materials that you're going to need to transport to a major landing zone to sell. So instead you'll have to pick something with a cargo grid for your boxes of product. Nowadays there are a lot of potential ships to choose from, so I'm just going to highlight a few. So newer players, and particularly those who may have relied on a rental Prospector, will be well served by a base Freelancer with its 66 SCU of capacity. The big advantage here is that you can rent it from any of the cargo decks around Everest Harbour, Port Tressler or Bikini Point. And really what I would do is I would look to build up quite a lot of jobs in the refinery, and then rent the Freelancer for one day and ship all of those jobs in one go so that I maximise the potential I get out of my rental. Other notable mentions for those of you looking to really get into mining and who want to buy a ship to handle your haulage would include the Freelancer Max, which offers 120 SCU for 2.2 million credits, the Connie Taurus 174 SCU for 3.3 million, the Drake Caterpillar, which is where you really get into the big leagues with space for 576 SCU for 4.6 million, but for the ultimate hauler you'll probably want to look at the Crusader Hercules C2. Which currently has the biggest capacity in game at 696 SCU, and it will set you back 4.9 million. If you happen to have one, a Carrack can also be a good option with 456 SCU and really good turret coverage, but at 26 million credits it's hard to recommend buying this ship purely as a hauler for your mining goods. Now I know I already talked about gear, and I know I already harped on about wearing armor and carrying a gun, but if you ignored me and have been busy mining away in your sperm suit, please don't risk it now. Minables themselves are only of some value to pirates. There are ways that they can profit out of the carcass of a mining ship, they can take the bags, but it's a lot more tedious and realistically it's a big use of their time. They'd arguably be a lot better served by just demanding a ransom from you if they do catch you. However, nothing has value like a cargo ship hauling all of those refined goods to market. These they can gleefully lift straight off your ship and cart off to the NQA terminals to sell themselves, leaving you in the red and them parting it up at Grimhex. I love my aerial armor, but for the cargo run I ditch it in favour of a heavy set. Movement debuffs don't count if you're an EVA. I also love my fancy Custodian SMG, but I ditch that in favour of an FS9 and a grenade launcher or a railgun if I've got one handy. Stack yourself with spare ammo, med pens and med guns. And I know that there will be some comments about how some people are solo through and through. If you can, there's nothing like bringing a mate or two along for your cargo runs. If you've been out multi-crew mining and your buddies want to get paid, make sure that they do this bit with you as well. A lot of pirates are after a soft target, and just by having the turrets manned and spitting death at them, you'll get free of a situation. When you're ready, make sure that your ship is claimed at the station and head down to the refinery deck. Select your ship from this destination drop-down on your job and click confirm to deliver. Be cautious of having two of the same ship at the station, as it can become impossible to distinguish between the two. If you do find yourself in this position, consider moving one of them away from the refinery station before you start putting jobs inside. And even be vigilant when you're loading up, and watch out for anyone standing around watching what you're doing. It's possible to see what's going on at these terminal screens when standing behind another player, and pirates will send operatives into refineries for exactly this purpose, looking out for anybody loading up a cargo ship with a load of jobs. If you're suspicious at all, simply load up your ship, then hop servers. When you're on board your ship, make sure to let your shields fully power up, get your core spotted and spool up your drive before opening the hangar doors up. And just like during the mining runs, a dogleg is highly recommended. So set your first QT point to somewhere other than whichever planet you're heading to. Get an idea of the direction that you're hanging in and then just don't hang around. Punch it as soon as you get out of that hangar and hit that first jump. And after travelling enough to get off the main route from the station to the planet, you can cut your jump and realign on the planet, then make the journey down to the LZ. Every major landing zone has a Trade and Development Division building, or TDD, where you'll be able to cash in via the terminals. You just head in here and select your cargo ship from the drop down, and then start selling all of the commodities on board. Then it's really just a case of avoiding stopping off at any of the ship shops and blowing all of your hard-earned cash. Don't forget that you maybe have mates to pay. Thank you so much for sticking with me all the way through this guide. I hope it's been useful to you and it's going to serve you in good stead for the patch to come. And I for one am hugely excited about the update, and even though the easy money might have gone out of mining, I'm loving the new challenges it's brought with it. There are new spots to find, new techniques to learn, and more reasons to group up with your mates. And quite honestly, these guides take quite a long time to put together. They're compiled over multiple runs and test flights, and I can't help but notice that the script for this video is currently exceeding my university dissertation by some margin. Usually after I get done on the push to get one of these done, I'm keen to do just about anything other than mining for a few weeks afterwards. But this is the first time in a while that after I get some much needed sleep, I just want to head back out and crack some more rocks. And one of the things that makes these videos easier and easier to make are the people over at our community and org, Frontier Consolidated, who've helped develop and test the strategies that I've outlined today. They've helped me every step of the way with this, and we're always open to new folks, so please feel free to follow the link down below to our Discord. The video description also contains links to all of the various sheets and resources that I've referenced during the guide, and hopefully in the not too distant future I'm going to get a shiny new website uploaded which will have all of these available to you. If you think I've earned it and you want to stay tuned for some more content, then please hit those like and subscribe buttons, and share the video with your friends, org mates, and your nan if she fancies cracking some rocks. It helps a huge amount. I do also have a Patreon, but just by sticking around to the end, you're already honestly doing more than enough. So with all that said, thanks very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time.